Okay, so I welcome everybody to our webinar, International Communication After Corona. We have the pleasure...
Sorry, you should give the participants some time. They're entering. You can see the number counting. When you started,
yes,
7,
okay.
Now they're 23, so just give them 2 or 3 minutes.
Yes, we have some more minutes that everyone can join.
All the technical procedure with Zoom always, if people are entering.
Okay, Holger, I will give you the host again, right? Or
I'm still host. I just gave you the
code.
Okay,
good. Okay, good. Perfect. Okay, so let's.
And now we're at 46, so most people who subscribed are there.
Yeah, see, perfect.
46.
Wow.
Okay, I think now you can start. Now everybody should be in.
This is wonderful. Okay, so thank you very much, Holger. I have the pleasure to welcome you for this International Communication After Corona webinar in the name of the EUPRERA board. My name is Ingenhoff. I'm the board of director at EUPRERA, as you know. And thanks to Holger Sievert from Macromedia University in Germany, we have the pleasure to have 3 panelists from 4 countries on 3 different continents discussing the situation and changes concerning the international corporate communication, organizational and marketing communication after changes like COVID pandemic we have right now from their own global home regions. So I have the pleasure to welcome our foreign Cara Alaimo from Hofstra University, USA, Ganga Danesh from Zayed University, United Arab Emirates, Stephen Waddington from Newcastle University, UK, and Holger Sievert is the chair, Macromedia University. Thanks to Holger for organizing this webinar. I hand over to Holger and yeah, let's go and start this exciting webinar.
Yeah, thank you very much, Diana. Also a very warm welcome from my side to, first of all, to our panelists, and then also to all our 46 other participants now. It's great to have you here. What we are planning for tonight, just to give you a short overview, we will start with a very little introductory speech for 5 minutes, perhaps, just to frame a little bit the discussion area. Then we will have around between 10-15 minutes discussing among these panelists how we observe the situation with international communication changing due to the COVID situation in different countries. Then we will a little bit discuss among us on the panel, and then we will be open for your questions, for your comments, and if you want, you're very happy to join us there and being part of that discussion. And all this is planned altogether for roughly 1 hour altogether, so ending at 7:30. And perhaps just can anybody of the normal participants, and if it's even in the chat, give me a sign or a note if they can hear me, because sometimes I experience technical problems with Zoom. Susanna is showing the hand. Okay, wonderful. So this is working. That's great. I prepared a little presentation to introduce into the subject. I will show you in a second. And here we go. Can you see my screen? Okay, that's great. So I would like to talk about international communication after Corona and how this is changing, and was a little bit the general observation. Since we also do have a lot of students in this webinar today, I'd like to start a little bit to make clear the importance of international and intercultural communication. That's a survey that's already some years old, about 6 or 7, from the European Communication Monitor that most of you might know. But what's interesting, within this survey, communication professionals from nearly 40 countries in Europe have been asked, in your daily job, do you communicate internationally with different countries or markets? And that was asked for joint stock companies as well, for private companies, for non-profit, and for governmental organizations. And what's interesting is you have the dark blue that's saying we are doing that regularly. And then you have the light blue who is to say we're doing it sometimes, and the gray, which is saying no. And what's very interesting in the structure is that 9 out of 10, if you take it all together, is saying we are doing communication internationally. So it's not a subject that's concerning only some people. It's really concerning most of communicators and communication people, at least of Europe and probably all over the world. The problem behind this is that pure simple translation of an information is not enough. what you have to do is something like translocation. Yeah, you have not only to translate a text from one country to another one. If you, for example, have the corporate headquarter and you want to give an information, or if you are an NGO like, I don't know, the WHO or anything like that, just making a translation is only helpful in a very limited way. You have to translocate it. So you have to adapt it to a cultural background, to other context. If you don't do that, you will be in many difficulties to be understood, to be misunderstood, starting with signs you are using in your communication, with wording and stuff like that. And regarding all this, there are different theoretical approaches being developed the last 10, 15 years. One was by Krishnamurti Sriramesh, and another one was co-developed by me. And that's the one, a little bit of an onion approach. And this onion approach is saying, if you are communicating from one country to many other countries, or between many different countries, it's not enough that you are just translating stuff. You have to look for very different context. You have to look, that's a little bit the outer layer of the onion, for the standard context. So a little bit for the general characteristic of the political and economic systems. And of course, for the more specific characteristic of the media system and what's linked to that one. Because if you are doing from Europe communication to China, or you have a Chinese entity doing communication to Europe, it's obvious it's not exactly the same political and economic system behind it, at least not political. Then you have the structure context. So media companies and all kinds of companies are organized very differently worldwide. We always think that a CEO or a president has exactly the same rights and functions. But for example, if you know the dual and the unitary board system, you know that the way how companies are organized is very different. So if you're communicating on corporate communication and you don't know anything about the structural context of the country or the countries you're communicating with, it's very difficult. The next one is the function context. These are dimensions of culture, like, for example, very standardized, described by Hofstra. And the last one is something like a role context, to understand who is acting there, what's his or her education, what's his or her cultural background. Is it a professional trained communicator? Is it just a former journalist? Or is it, I don't know, somebody who studied biology and is now responsible, for example, for communicating in this COVID situation or whatever, as an overall. So that's a little bit the framework. And for this framework, we proposed a lot of more in-depth analytical stuff, like based on Helen Mancini, looking for characteristics of the political system and the media system, starting with time of democratization and ending at the importance of state in the media system, continuing in the structure context with the dimensions of corporate finance and corporate governance. So how is all this organized? Looking in the function context on cultural aspect, like Hofstede, we also can have Turner, Trumpeners, other stuff, very limited, but for a first approach, very helpful. For example, power distance, uncertainty avoidance, difference in gender roles, which are very different from country to country. And finally, looking for the role context. And if you're in classical PR, that would be for journalists. If you're in social media subject, it would be more for influencers. What's their background? What's the academic degree? And what is the self-understanding? Am I a journalist who's understanding I want to be a watchdog of government, like in some European countries? Or is the understanding more like providing entertainment, yeah? Like, for example, in some Anglo-Saxonian countries? Or is it more like simply reporting news quickly, like perhaps in more totalitarian systems? And that's interesting for looking from this one. If you compare this country by country, what you can do, you can make a grid, you can look for the different dimensions. And if you look for the different dimensions, you can describe so where points are in common and where are gaps regarding this global communication, this corporate communication gaps. And that's a little bit the research we did the last 10 years, looking for different countries, for different world regions, where are big gaps, where are small gaps, even inside Europe, where are big and small gaps, and what are the points we have to take attention if we are communicating internationally. And what's interesting for tonight now is really looking is if all these kind of political approaches, might be my one, or Krishnamurti Sriramesh, or another one, are they still valid with all the changes linked to COVID-19? Are they still valid in the situation where we have nearly 45 million global cases and more than 1 million people who are dead? And we have many countries with lockdowns or partial lockdowns or developments like that one. And linked to that one, we have a high level of digitalization communication that is accelerating much quicker, at least what I can observe in Germany, much quicker than I would say the last 10, 15 years. Yeah, we have perhaps 6 months, and what happened there is more than in the last 10 or 15 years regarding communication. For example, I just finished one study for the German Protestant Church, which in Germany is still a very official church in the media. The church visited its online services. Now in this COVID year, we have the situation that about 65 did that at least one time. So tremendous change, just to give that example. And linked with this one, more specifically, will an even quicker digitalization of communications in all disciplines due to the virus situation change the game somehow also? Change the game of our understanding of PR and corporate communication people? Will we just be taken over by all this empirical marketing guys, yeah, who are just doing big data stuff, and corporate communication people are no more needed? It might be a hypothesis. I don't, it's not my thinking, but it's a discussion that's coming up more and more. That's one example. To that one is here from Asa D. Little, showing the first impacts of COVID-19 on the customer journey. And you already can see, if you look on the customer journey for selling a product, a very simple example of marketing communication, you have the in-reach, you have the configuration, you have the test drive and all this stuff. And at the beginning, all this was middle important in this sector, and all the other one not so quick. But now all is filled out, and all the process is more or less an automated, very quick and very changing process in the customer journey, where currently other aspects are more important than info reach or getting to people or stuff like that. And that's a little bit just to frame the picture, how I understand international communication, why I think that the COVID situation might be changing it. And that's a little bit what I wanted to discuss with you guys tonight. And I'm very happy to have you here. As already announced, it's Kara as Alaimo from the Hofstra University in the US. It's Ganga Danesh from the Sievert University in the United Arab Emirates, who has a lot of other Asian background, but something you can explain yourself. And it's Stephen Waddington from Newcastle University in the UK, who also is a very international guy, looking a lot around what else is happening there and what's going on there. So that's a little bit the framework we have today. That was already my short introduction. I hope I stick to this about 5 to 7 minutes. Yeah, and I would like to discuss this with you. And I really would like to start a little bit more general. Perhaps we start discussing a little bit the current COVID situation, and then in a second step, the communication situation. So perhaps let's start in the US with Kara. Kara, if you describe very shortly, what is the COVID situation currently in the US, and what do you think, very roughly, on a general level, what implication that might have on corporate communication, first of all in general, and later on, for a second question, international communication?
Certainly. Well, in the United States, I think it's fair to say that the situation is out of control. We're seeing COVID cases skyrocketing in many states across the country. And so it's really quite frightening. Obviously, we're just a few days out now from a presidential election. And I think it's fair to say that this is likely to be the deciding issue in the election. We've seen in the presidential debate so far that the pandemic has really dominated the conversation. So obviously this will have a huge impact on the country broadly. There was a piece in the New York Times this week that talked about how major companies in the United States had originally, as you know, people are working from home, and major companies had set their target dates to return to the office to January, and now July is the new January, and who knows whether that will hold. I think, you know, we still don't have a vaccine, obviously. And for those of us who are parents, I think the situation is even more concerning because there are not even trials underway, for good reason, on children to develop a vaccine for children. So this is a situation that is going to affect the United States dramatically for the foreseeable future. A big question now for companies is when they'll start to return to the office. I suspect it will be long past January and long past July as well. We've seen record numbers of women dropping out of the workforce in the United States, which is going to have a huge impact on corporate culture. And so between August and September, I believe the vast majority of people who dropped out of the workforce were women, because women, as we know, take on more of the child care responsibilities and are really struggling to work full time and also take care of their children and educate their children who are in many cases studying online right now. And obviously we know that this situation will have devastating impacts on the careers of the individual women who've dropped out of the workforce. Of course, we know it takes years, decades for their salaries and careers to recover, if ever, when you take time off. But I also think we should be thinking about what the impact will be for the women and for all of us who remain in the workforce after this exodus of women. And studies have consistently shown that it takes a critical mass of women in order to have an impact on an organization's decision-making. So for instance, it isn't enough to just add one woman to a leadership team or to a board. You typically need between 20 and 30% of an organization to be female before women start actually exercising serious influence. And so if that's the case, I think that there's a lot of questions about what's going to happen to the women who remain and whether they'll still be able to exercise the same amount of influence and how that will impact corporate decision making. And more broadly, with people working from home, from a corporate communication perspective, you're dealing with a lot of unique challenges. Some of them are logistical challenges of how to communicate with your team and keep everyone on course when they're no longer in the same place. But obviously, we know that Americans are hugely stressed, that parents are dealing with children who are home and all of a sudden supposed to sort of work full-time while being full-time teachers and full-time childcare providers. And then the US has also been rocked by protests and the Black Lives Matter movement. And so a lot of Americans are sort of stressed to the max. And I think it's really important for organizations to think very carefully about how to communicate with employees who are feeling very vulnerable. There's a lot of concern that there will be violence after the US election. And whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or an independent, everyone is concerned about that outcome right now in the country. So Americans are stressed, and it's really important, I think, for organizations to be focused on internal communication and how to communicate sensitively, given all of the challenges that their employees are almost certainly facing. Mm-hmm. I also have a great deal to say about international communication, but shall I pause there?
That in a second step. Okay, let's continue, Ganga, if that's okay for you. Let's perhaps continue with a man in the middle. That would be Stephen in this case, because you don't have Donald Trump, but you have Boris Johnson. I was sure you didn't like that comment so much, but anyway, can you perhaps elaborate a little bit on the situation in the UK? And I know you also have a little bit an overview also outside the UK from some other Anglo-Saxonian countries.
So similar to Cara, we've got a populist government in the UK, led by Boris Johnson, and we're now in dealing with a second wave, a second spike, and the country is back in lockdown. So the first spike was characterized by a complete lockdown for 12 or 13 weeks, where all but essential workers had to stay at home. Essential workers, essential shops such as supermarkets and pharmacists were the only ones that were allowed to be open. And that you described it perfectly, Holger. During that time, we had this, in those 4 or 5 months, we had this rapid onboarding to digital forms of communication and this rapid shift to virtual organizations. Certainly within 2 or 3 of the businesses I was involved with, we literally went to virtual working. over the period of a weekend. Then there was a euphoria in July and August where the country gradually started to move out of lockdown. And there was a sense that we could see life returning to normal, and a route to some sort of life, not living beyond the virus, but along with the virus. I think that there's been a misleading narrative throughout this crisis that there will be life, you know, life beyond COVID-19, and that's come from political leaders. It's also come from organizational leaders. It's also come from natural human instinct to optimism bias, that we somehow manage to navigate through this and find a route alongside the virus. We won't until there's a vaccine or herd immunity. I mean, it's clear. We're seeing, you know, this is where the UK government's been caught short, going into a second spike now. So if I describe the situation now in the UK, we've come through this cycle of back to work, back to the office. Not many citizens did go back to the office. Not many employers opened up the office, and so there wasn't really a return to the office. And we've now gone back to, after the universities returned in September and early October, we've gone back to this situation where the virus is spreading, and the government's concerned that it's going to be cut. The rate of infection is exponential again, and so the government's implemented this system of lockdown throughout the UK, dependent on the rate of infection in a local area. You've also seen a split between the different nations. So Scotland, England, and Wales all have different attitudes or different means of lockdown. So Scotland has its own. Wales has gone into what it's calling a 2-week fire break, where it's completely locked down. In England, in the UK, we have this system of 3 tiers. One being the most lenient, 3 the most severe, and in areas in the northern cities where the spread of the virus is and rates of infection are highest, the lockdown is almost complete, and we're back in the situation where all but essential services essential supermarkets and pharmacies are open. We're learning to talk about the economy. We've seen GDP, well, the OECD, the numbers I was looking at yesterday, says the economy at the end of the year will have shrunk by about 10%. We're the worst hit in Europe. And I think that's reflective of the government's approach to management, which has been at times chaotic. But business is learning to live alongside the virus. You cited that chart from After Little. I haven't seen that before, but areas of the economy that aren't affected directly. So, you know, directly impacted: culture, entertainment, sport, you know, completely wiped out, require ongoing government intervention. Other areas of the economy, though, are clearly learning to live with the virus, live alongside the virus, vaccinate the supply chains, and are starting to see some sort of return to normality. And you know, there's this huge impact then on the workforce in working from home that Cara talked about. We've seen, so Cara mentioned the gender issue. There's a huge social economic issue. So that's a particular challenge. There's also a challenge with age. So, you know, I've had a fairly decent lockdown. I have a nice house and some space and can move around. If I've just left university and I'm maybe 2 or 3 years into my career and I'm sharing a house with 3 or 4 other people, I've had an awful time. So we've seen there's been a real impact, societal impact on many strata actually, and that's a particular one that concerns me. So that's the situation in the UK. We're currently in lockdown. We're talking that Christmas is cancelled. Who knows? But I cannot see families coming together and gathering over Christmas with the current rates of infection, frankly.
Okay, let's see what kind of Christmas we are going to have. Anyway, but probably this Christmas is to being closer to the Christmas 2000 years ago, at least regarding some surrounding situations, with people being on lockdown and other areas. Thank you very much, Stephen, for this little view into the UK. Ganga, Danesh, you are now in the United Arab Emirates, but if I remember correctly, you originally studied at the University of Singapore. And you specialized a lot, and so it's also your topic in internal strategy and CSR and strategic communication. So from your perspective for the Arabian area and perhaps also for the Asian area a little bit, the COVID situation and also the communication situation for companies in general.
Yeah, thank you, Holger. So particularly in Asia and this part of the world, I mean, it's a very diverse area to kind of give a one size fits all statement. But if I were to go by the UAE specifically, I would say that the leadership adopted a very phased approach to dealing with the pandemic. When we started out, of course, everything went into lockdown. It was very quick, and there was for almost a month, it was a complete lockdown. There were disinfection drives, so very strong top-down leadership. The National Emergency Crisis and Disasters Management Authority, I mean, they were at the forefront. The Ministry of Health was at the forefront of briefing people. But as time went on, they adopted a more balanced approach with they really didn't want it to impact the economy that much. I mean, obviously it has huge impacts, and almost 10% of the population is predicted to leave the country in terms of expatriates leaving the country, because one characteristic of the UAE is almost 90% of the population are expatriates. Only about 10% are local. And almost 10% of this is expected to leave because of job losses, layoffs, etc. But they have opened up. Periodically, there would be, it's kind of adjusting to the situation. So sometimes there is more restrictions, nighttime curfew. Sometimes it's relaxed. So at this point in time, schools are back. Everyone is back in schools, and they're managing it with a lot of social distancing. They even opened, there is something called Global Village here, which is where a lot of, it's like a place where everyone comes from different parts of the country. It's like a kind of like an exhibition. Even that has opened up, but with a lot of precautions in place and a lot of monitoring in place, trying to balance taking the hit to the economy with keeping health priorities. So what has this done to our world as we know it? In my understanding, I think, and from a communications perspective also, is that we have become very hyper-mediated and hyper-connected at the same time. Hyper-mediated in the sense that there's been this massive reduction in face-to-face interactions. So the human-to-human touch points between organizations and publics have reduced dramatically, and it's become hyper-mediated, and that affects places where we work, we shop, we play, we hang out. At the same time, it's hyper-connected in the sense that in a smaller bubble, in the domestic space, there is intense interaction. So I kind of look at it as a hub and spoke model. So you have this little bubble of domestic space where the home has become the space where we now work, we play, we shop, we hang out. But then you have all these little spokes reaching out through media, and you're intensely connected to the rest of the world, but it's mediated. So, I mean, what does that really mean for brands and organizations? in this part of the world, we recently had a Middle East Public Relations Association conference where a lot of communication leaders got together to share their insights on how it was affecting them. One of the biggest concerns, of course, was the hit on budgets. So everyone was sharing about how budgets for PR, communication, marketing have taken a deep hit and what that means for agencies, small and large. And I think the general consensus there was there is a very strong need now to focus on what they see as fundamentals, on what we are supposed to do in terms of focusing on purpose, being purpose driven, on creating content that is meaningful to our stakeholders. So there was this real hesitance to just jump out and do the general communication that they will do, whether it's to promote your goods and services, instead to create content that meant something to people when we are going through such times. Just to focus on fundamentals like building trust and relationships, focusing on employee well-being. So they also focused a lot on delivering value, obviously, because when budgets are getting cut, they were really looking at going the digital route, going the social route, again, driven mostly by economic reasons. And finally, as I think Kara mentioned, internal communication. So apparently after the crisis hit, of all the demand for services across crisis communication, internal comm, social media, content creation, and community management, internal communication had the highest demand. And we also just ran, Zayed University ran a study on employee engagement in the UAE. And the findings were really so interesting because we wanted to know that when people are suddenly thrust into these remote work situations, what is really the most important thing that they're looking for? Is it crisis communication? Specifically, is it internal crisis comm? Do you want to hear from your organization on how they are managing the crisis? Or is it new ways of working? Is it the sense of control you have over your time, your working, the tools you have to work with? Or was it two-way communication? Interestingly, we found that, of course, everything impacted employee engagement, but the factor that most impacted was two-way communication. So more than anything else, yes, we get plenty of crisis communication information from outside sources as well. So from our own organizations, we want to be heard, we want to be listened, we need this communication to be open both ways. So that was kind of really very interesting for us. So, I mean, considering all that we have been saying so far, I mean, you spoke about how technology is kind of becoming king, which is true. I mean, it's going to be highly technology enabled. But even while that is so, it is really fascinating that people want to be heard. People want their voices to be listened to by their organization. So I believe, even if technology is going to be the main enabler for PR, communication, marketing, I think it's still our fundamental, factors that we exist for, that we are good at. To connect with people, to listen to people. As Jim McNamara said, we need to move from this architecture of speaking to an architecture of listening. And that's ever more so important in the time of the pandemic, right? That we have to foreground listening to our people, to not just to employees, to our communities, and then to create content that is meaningful to them. It's no longer really just what adds to the bottom line, but to create content that makes sense for them at this point in time, so that even post-pandemic, we still stay relevant as organizations and brands in people's lives.
I would agree that that is very important, but you also mentioned all this budget reductions. So, but as far as I understood, your companies are still willing to invest money in listening to people and on focusing on that one, because I know many cases where especially this is currently cut due to budget situation and stuff. But you would say in your case, it's still possible that companies are doing that. But perhaps we look, I understood you correctly, right?
Yes, I mean, that's why the focus is now on social. So they're trying to deliver value through going through the social media.
Let's stick to this point of internal communication and listening to your employees. I think it's a very important and interesting one. And let's also look for this one perhaps in the other situation. Kara, do you have similar experience in the US, or is it more like cost cutting, firing people due to the pandemic, and please don't talk because listening takes time? Or is it the same experience that Ganga is having in the United Arab Emirates?
You know, I think that brands are trying to understand what people are saying both internally and externally right now. And what we're finding is that a lot of brands are trying to communicate about the pandemic, are trying to communicate about the election, or trying to communicate about the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think a lot of what's determining how those communications are received is really their past behavior and reputations. And so we know from a Weber-Shandwick study that in general, when a company takes a stance on an issue, people are much more likely to view the company and the issue that they're involved in favorably if it's related to their past actions and core business in some way. But if it's not related to their past behavior and lived values and brand identity in some way, consumers become skeptical and think that basically it's really a marketing ploy or an attempt to ultimately make money. And so I think that one of the things that this pandemic has shown, and all of the related crises, is the need for organizations to articulate their values early on and to live by those values. I wrote a column for Bloomberg. I was asked to write advice on how companies should respond to the Black Lives Matter movement, which is of course happening within the context of the pandemic here in the United States. And I said, well, if you have a reputation for listening to people and for activism on this issue, now's the time to talk. But if you don't, I don't think your messages will be very well received. Actions really do speak louder than words. And so I think that that's a really sort of important part of this. And I think one thing to consider is that, you know, again, all of these communications are happening certainly in the US in a context of heightened crisis communication overall. So I would really date a lot of this to the 2016 US presidential election in the United States. And really after that, one of the things I focus on is crisis communication. I was flown across the country and even internationally to talk to PR professionals about how to respond to all of the new challenges that had cropped up at that time. And originally it was fake news, but it's also Twitter wars. It's this new risk that President Trump might call out your company on Twitter and how you're going to respond to that. In the United States, certainly since the US presidential election in 2016, there's all of a sudden been a new expectation that corporations will articulate political stances. And then there's been employee and endorser backlash for those stances. And a lot of companies have really struggled about how to get this right. So Nordstrom is a major retailer that used to sell a line by Ivanka Trump, the president's daughter. First, Nordstrom was boycotted by people for selling the line. And then when Nordstrom announced that they were discontinuing the line, they were boycotted by Trump supporters. And so a lot of companies feel, how do I get this right? And I think what we hadn't seen until that time is this real willingness for employees to speak out publicly and criticize their employers. I wrote a whole piece for Harvard Business Review about what to do when your own employees and endorsers attack you. Really until we saw Under Armour's paid endorsers attacking the company publicly for its perceived support of Trump, I don't think any PR professional in the United States had seen endorsers, paid endorsers, go on a public attack against the brand that they were endorsing before. That was something new.
Yes, you have a special mixture, yeah, because you have the pandemic, and at the same time you have anyway a very polarized society, and now it's getting even more polarized due to the pandemic. Stephen, in the UK, if you look, would you agree? What I'm hearing a little bit from Ganga and also from Kara is bad times for nations and people, but perhaps good times for communication people, because currently there are a lot of things to do that are very valuable to companies, and perhaps what we do is more respected than it was seen perhaps 2 or 3 years ago.
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting when you do the ECM study again this next year, because I undoubtedly that will be borne out. I think if you've worked in public services and public sector, so you've been part of the frontline response within government or local government or within a health service, you almost certainly, your role, if you didn't have a direct report up to board level, you almost certainly do now. The same with international large organizations as well, where, as both my colleagues have suggested, organizations have really looked to the communication function to be the ears of the organization, both internally with internal publics and also external publics. I think unfortunately, if you've worked in a marketing communications role, either in agency or in-house within an organization that has been exposed to areas of the crisis, the areas of the economy most sharply hit by the crisis, so thinking about sport, entertainment, culture, you unless you've had government support, you've faced a hard time. That's an area where we're seeing redundancies in communication. There's been a furlough scheme in the UK that's coming to an end. It's changing at the end of the month, at the end of October, and we're starting to see redundancies take place there. The trade association in the UK put out some very stark numbers in April or May time that suggested up to 20% of the communication profession could be impacted from an employment point of view. And I don't think it's been that severe, and it's certainly not, it's not equal, because on the one hand, in large international organizations or in public sector organizations, the crisis has elevated the role of the communication function, and other areas of the economy have been starkly hit. I think internal communication in particular has served the organizations well during the crisis, particularly come to the fore. And we've seen, adoption of all sorts of new technologies, new forms of media to support those functions.
Okay, thank you. But that's an interesting observation. So at least good perspective for communication as a profession, not due to a good reason, but I don't want to make anything nice there. That's not my intention, but at least a good perspective there. What I also heard in all your 3 statements, perhaps that's also due to my questions and the comparative approach, is a little bit that all the countries are, I would observe the same for Germany, are a little bit clothing more to themselves, yeah? Like who is allowed to enter, who is allowed not to enter, if you enter, how long you have to stay in quarantine, if you have foreign workers there who have to leave the country, if you look for the US, anyway, you had this America First, or you have still this America First president, or if you look for the UK, already before was a movement regarding the Brexit and all what's linked to that one. That means good time for communication, but bad times for international communication? Or how would you say that? Perhaps we start this time with Stephen. So good times for communication in general, but bad times for international communication?
So I think organizations are leaning on their communication function, yes, to be the eyes and ears of organizations across borders. You're completely right. From countries countries have almost turned it on themselves and focused on very much internally. on their own issues, and that's disappointing actually, because that's despite despite the fact that there's lots of calls for an international response to this crisis. Certainly in the UK, the response is very national. I'm a very proud European, and Brexit breaks my heart. And here we are. We still haven't got an exit agreement, and I really hope we do, because for all the UK has seen a 10% hit to GDP from the crisis, if we don't get a deal with our European partners, and that could be another 5 or 10% hit come January. So I'm sat here praying that we do. But yeah, it's from an international point of view, it's a tough time, because organized countries are certainly turning inward.
Yeah, Cara, anyway, the US always have been somehow very intercultural, but often not very international, from my observation to some point. Has this been getting even worse due to the pandemic now?
I suspect so. So you started our presentation by talking about different models of international communication and public relations. And I researched and wrote a book called Pitch, Tweet, or Engage on the Street, which focuses on how to adapt your public relations messages and strategies for different countries and cultures, specifically because I felt that when people teach or talk about global PR in the United States, they're often talking about taking what works in the United States and sending it to other countries. And one of the things I found in doing my research is that what works well in the United States does not work in Canada, let alone in the UK or the UAE or Nigeria. And so you started by talking about different models. The model that I approached in my book uses the GLOBE study, which was a 10-year study by over 170 researchers around the world that categorized the world's people into 10 different cultural clusters. And I use those cultural clusters as my guide and go to each of the world's cultural clusters and look at the characteristics that define people and explain how to adapt your PR messages and strategies accordingly. But certainly I think that the US has a long way to go in recognizing some of these differences. And I do think that COVID will set us back. And I'll give you just one example of these cultural differences in crisis communication, which would affect how people communicate about the pandemic. And that is that in Confucian cultures, we know that people avoid what scholars have called risky communication. And so if you grow up in a Confucian culture, you're taught from a young age that talking about a problem makes the problem worse. So the best thing to do if you have a problem is not to tell anyone. Now, of course, we know that companies and organizations in every part of the world, in the United States and Germany, like Volkswagen and Facebook, have covered things up. So this is certainly not a problem unique to Confucian Asia. But I conducted interviews with almost 100 senior executives for my book. And one of the things I consistently heard from heads of crisis at major global agencies was really hard to convince clients in Confucian Asia to be open and transparent. That's of course where this pandemic emerged, because there is even more of a tradition and sort of a willingness to stay silent. So just one example of why we sort of can't afford not to understand these cultural differences.
Thank you. Ganga, with you staying currently in a country with more expatriates than original people, if you want somehow, can you afford to have less international communication? Is it something that's happening currently, or you are still very much international communication due to the very hyper-connected situation already before, just taking your own wording?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking the same when others were answering, because in the UAE, I mean, I'm sure even the US and a lot of other countries, there is extremely high levels of diversity within the country itself. So we have almost 200 nationalities in the UAE. So in fact, that's one of the challenges that is faced by communicators here. Because how do you communicate anything to this kind of diverse audiences? So, I mean, there are different strategies people adopt. Like, for example, we have international agencies, of course, so they would have people on board, communicators on board that represent diversity. But again, having said that, of course, there are large groups that are represented here, and they make sure that people are there on board who understand these diverse groups. But in addition to just domestic communication, which in and of itself needs to be diverse, as I was mentioning earlier, we are now in a hypermediated situation. What that means is there is a lot of international collaboration happening, although people may not be moving physically across borders. You know, having Zoom and having access to all these online technologies means that now there can be much more collaboration across. I mean, look at even this webinar that's happening, where there's collaboration across. So in one of the Middle East Public Relations Association's conferences, the head of one of the ad agencies, PR agencies, shared the need to have chief cultural officers, particularly in these times, because there's so much of collaboration happening across, even within the agencies, across their offices, across the globe. So, so while, yes, physical movement has been impacted, there has been an explosion in terms of mediated communication across. And I think that really needs for really high levels of intercultural communication.
Okay, thank you very much to all three of us. If you don't mind, I would like to open the discussion now a little bit for at least some questions from the so far silent public. You can write them either in the chat or in the FAQ, or if you want, we can also unmute you that you can talk to us directly. I've seen the participant list, we have a wide mixture. Yeah, we have really corporate communication people from small companies, from large companies. We have students, we have EUPRERA and PRSR members, so we have a broad spectrum currently here. So I'm interested at least to have 3 or 4, 5 questions would be great. The first question was just posted on FAQ by Habib Ali. It's a question for you, Ganga. If you look for that one, the discussion only focused on the native UAE people. What did the government do for the workers from India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan in the name of internal communication? Do you have any information on that, please?
That's a great question, Habib. Thank you for asking the question. So yes, you're right that, I mean, the local, the nationals are just 10%, and of the remaining 90% expatriates, a large population are the laborers who are in the labor camps. As you know, countries that have labor accommodation, including Singapore and the UAE, have been struggling with accommodation in labor camps simply because they are really very densely accommodated. So there definitely have been issues in managing that, but I'm happy to share that a lot of NGOs have stepped up, people have stepped up, business men have stepped up, and there have been a lot of efforts to help some of these workers sometimes get back home because they have been retrenched. I mean, projects that have been cancelled and people have been losing jobs. So there has been really an outpouring of support from people, not just NGOs, but individual businessmen and women who have offered free meals, free tickets, because, you know, I mean, their condition is really very, very challenging. As it is, they live in conditions that are quite challenging. But when the pandemic hit, it really became an issue. But I'm happy to say, like I said, there was a lot of support, and I think that has been working quite well.
Yeah. Habib Ali, did that answer your question? Okay, he doesn't want to, or he's not able to answer to us, but I hope it answered his question. Do you have other questions among those who were so far listening? I think we have a very broad, varied public, so please feel free to answer questions. either on international communication or on each of the countries, or perhaps on what does it mean for young people if they are studying now, for future job perspective, whatever. Do you have questions on that one? Denisa Helenova, okay, I will try to put you on. Denisa, you should be able to talk now.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Perfect. I wrote my question in the chat. I'd be very much interested if anybody's doing a comparative international project on government communication. So we'd like to participate on a case study from the Czech Republic, which is sadly currently the worst in COVID situation. So if anybody is into government communication, so please let me know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We will. Myself, I did a project with the German government comparing governmental communication of 10 European countries, especially social media communication. But that's not currently in the COVID situation. It was before, but that would be interesting to exchange there. But I don't know, Ganga, Kara, Stephen, anybody of you in this context? If not, also if anybody else of the participants is there, please put it into the chat and we will be happy to connect you to. Another question came from Sandra Bergman. Sandra, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, do you want to give your question yourself, perhaps?
Yes, sure. The question was about remote work. Kara was talking about how or when organizations would return to normal or whatever normal will be. But I'm going to be working a lot with remote work and virtual work for the upcoming year. So I wanted to ask you, how common do you think it will be for organizations to continue to work remotely?
I think it's going to be very common. And I think, again, I've spoken about the challenge for internal communicators, but I think what that means is that although obviously every economy is hurting right now because of the pandemic, over time, now that businesses have learned that in fact workers can be remote, and a lot of companies are saying, companies in tech, for instance, are saying that a lot of their staffers will have an opportunity to stay remote after the pandemic. I think the reason why this is ultimately over the very long term going to make internal communication even more important is because if workers can work from anywhere, our job options are going to expand dramatically, right? Because they won't be tied to the location where we live. And if that's the case, I think over time, the competition for talent is going to become even fiercer. And if that happens, again, companies will be challenged to keep their employees loyal through building strong relationships and through very strong internal communication. So yes, I think remote work will continue during the pandemic and long past it, with huge implications for corporate communication.
Okay, thank you, Kara. We have one last question, or perhaps one more is coming. I will take it. If not, it's probably the last question by a person who didn't want to give his or her name, but that's okay. The question is, what influence might home office have on innovation and progress? I think it's a question that makes a lot of sense if you're looking for how innovation is happening and how it's possible to happen. The person said, I just heard recently the sentence, you need the box to think outside the box. Stephen, I think innovation is quite a subject for you also, and also for your consulting perspective. Do you want to comment on that one?
So I think you said it at the outset, we've seen, and I think this is a number from McKinsey, that we've seen within 5 months, 5 years of innovation. And I think it's probably even more than that. Innovation, yes, in terms of media, because anything that isn't digital hasn't worked. So out of home or print just hasn't worked. But innovation, as Kara talked also spoke to in how we work, and I think this kind of relates to the last question. The future of the organization has to be hybrid. I think the challenge we have though within organizations is our governance and our communication has to catch up with this level of innovation. And if we're going to end on a positive note, and I'd love to, I think organizations are reliant on communicators to help bridge that gap between the huge changes we've seen and the acceleration we need in organizational governance to catch up.
Great, thank you very much. Is there any other question? Anybody who still wants to ask a question, either by talking or by giving a sign or by using the chat, whatever. We have many channels, doesn't make it easier to head a session. But anyway, yeah, there's one, there are two more. One is from Susanna. Susanna, would you mind asking your question yourself?
Sure, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can. And we can't see you, but we can see your very nice dog.
Yeah, I just wanted to know how do you think COVID will impact future career prospects for us students, and especially for students graduating in the times of the pandemic?
Who likes to answer on that one? Ganga, perhaps you? You have many different international perspectives on students.
Yeah, that's a great question, Susanna. And I find a lot of students are now trying to continue with their education because the job market is quite challenging. So some of them are continuing with their masters, and some of them, and this I think is happening across universities. Universities are trying to encourage a lot of innovation and entrepreneurship initiatives. In Dubai, for example, the Dubai Future Foundation has launched a university entrepreneurship program, and quite a few of the universities have signed up. So the idea there is, even in the field of communication, to encourage people to launch out on their own, to figure out entrepreneurial paths forward, would be in the immediate, I would say probably in the next 1 to 2 years, until the economy really recovers. That could be a potential track to consider.
Great, thank you very much. Anyway, also we are planning that from Macromedia. For example, in our last semester, we always have one part of the program focusing on entrepreneurship, and another part focusing on HR in normal companies. So really to balance that a bit. But I think that will be changing a lot, unfortunately, especially for those who are leaving right now. I think in 1 or 2 years will be good, but now it's difficult. And one last question, that's an anonymous one again. It's especially to Kara. Kara, are you still with us? I can't see you currently, but are you still with us? Or has she gone technically? Okay, then that's the question. Nevertheless, I think we can answer this. Did COVID influence the election in any way? Did it actually make people think about twice who to vote for, and our predictions of how it will go? Well, I'm not in the US, but as everybody has seen the debate between Trump and Biden 3 days ago, 4 days ago, I think it was very obvious that the part of the COVID discussion was much bigger. No, Kara is back. Kara, the question was, did COVID influence the election in your country in any way? And did it make people actually think twice about who to vote for, and any prediction of how it will go? That's a question to Kara. Kara, can you hear me?
Sorry. You cut out slightly. Yes, you cut out slightly, but is the question whether the pandemic has affected who people are?
Okay, I don't know if it's the same for you, Stephen, but I cannot hear her probably. Can you?
I can't hear you.
Okay, Kara, in this case, would you mind asking this question just by writing, in this case, just among the Q&A? Because we can't hear you. I will can you try to answer this question just by writing? Because we cannot hear you. F and Q, and then the last question, just if you write the answer would be great. Okay, so thank you very much. We are 8 minutes behind the time, but we started some minutes later. So thank you very much to all of you, especially to Ganga, to Stephen, and to Kara, who accepted the invitation tonight for discussing the 60 minutes around about communication, international communication, comparative communication. I learned much this evening because we had very different perspective and we have very different ways to see things. And I got some nice models, and I also got to know a lot of differences that are still in this quite similar situation with COVID-19. If you want to have the presentation, or if you have more questions, I put in my coordinate in the presentation also at the beginning. If not, I will enter in the chat also now again my email address and my Instagram account. So if you want, you can use one of those to get more information and to see more on what kind of research we are doing in the subject. I'd like to thank you very much, Susanna, Habib, and Sandra, and all the others for the Sandra, I had them, Habib, yeah, for the additional questions and comments. I think that makes it much more lively. It's always great if the audience is not only staying in the dark. And for the closing, I would like to hand over one last time to Diana.
Yes, thank you very much. That was really inspiring, the webinar, and thank you for bringing together all these interesting people from 3 continents. Really, really exciting. And yes, all the best and stay healthy. All the best from EUPRERA board, and hope to see you soon, hopefully face-to-face again. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye to all of you. Have a nice evening.
Bye-bye.
Stay healthy.